Hey guys, so in this video I wanted to talk about how hard you should train, because this is a topic that I think there's a lot more nuance to than people really give it credit for. And you know, some more prolific figures in the industry kind of just claim this is just train harder than last time, and like, while that does have some merit, and you know, I'm going to discuss that in this video, there is a little bit more nuance to that in terms of how hard you should train and practical application to your training. So in this video I wanted to delve into that. So we're answering this question. There are three primary metrics that we need to consider when we're answering, and that's going to be tension on the muscle cell, so the actual mechanical tension, going to be overall training volume, and then it's going to be your overall relative effort. And I'm going to explain each one of those one by one. So first, starting off with tension. So tension is just going to be how much external load you have placed on the muscles. So how much weight are you lifting? You know, we know that 45 pounds is more, you know, tension on the muscle, more weight than 25 pounds is. And what tension does, why it's important, is that by actually, your muscles have these things called mechanoreceptors that innervate the muscle cells. And they're going to help signal, you know, with tension, with a large enough tension stimulus to, you know, various molecular pathways in the muscle cell to have neurological adaptations for strength and muscular adaptations for hypertrophy. Because essentially, if you're having that tension, your body's going to be like, holy crap, like we need to grow, we need to start having these changes, so then, you know, we don't die in the future, since your body doesn't want to die. And so it's going to get bigger, going to get stronger over time. And so that's what basically tension is going to be going over. Now, somebody might think, okay, well, you know, if more tension equals more growth and more strength gain, you know, why not just do singles all the time? And that's where we come to training volume. So while one repetition is going to be a lot of tension and a large training stimulus for, you know, the largest per magnitude that you could really get for any, you know, sort of training dose, it's just going to not have enough sufficient training volume to actually spur adaptations. Outside of, like, say you're a ranked novice or whatnot. It's not going to be like enough training volume, and training volume can just be conceptualized as overall time under tension. So for example, 10 sets is going to be longer time under tension. I mean, 10 reps is going to be a longer time under tension. Well, I guess three sets too. Then, you know, three reps or one set is going to be. So there has to be enough time under tension, enough training volume to actually have those adaptations take place. That's why, if we're talking about overall strength training and like long-term development for hypertrophy and whatnot, since strength is multifactorial, you know, why doing just constantly like sets of like 1 to 3 probably aren't the best. And you know, why probably even, you know, for reasons I'm going to discuss later, why probably doing 5 or more reps is really, really good for maximizing long-term strength and hypertrophy adaptations in most lifters. So training volume, you know, can just be conceptualized as sets, just because although the mathematical volume is sets times reps times load times distance traveled, we're essentially only talking about one person, so this distance travel is going to be same for that person, because it's based off of limb length and all that. And then the actual weight being used can be kind of canceled out as long as you're training within the appropriate loading parameters I'll be discussing later. But the third primary training metric that we're going to be considering is relative effort. This can be thought as what you're doing relative to your maximum capabilities. And anybody who's been training for a while kind of knows that we do measure this on an RPE scale, rate of perceived exertion, on a scale of 1 to 10, or an RIR, repetitions in reserve system. So for example, an RPE 7 means you have three repetitions in reserve. So that means that you're basically training with whatever load you're using 3 reps below your maximum capabilities. Whereas, you know, an RPE 10, 0 repetitions in reserve, you're training all out at your maximum capabilities. And so there has to be appropriate amount of relative effort applied to actually have, you know, adaptations. And this is where Greg Doucette's whole train harder than last time thing kind of has its merit. Like, you need to have enough relative effort to actually have gains and, you know, be training harder over time. And I'll discuss how to do that later on in order to have those adaptations. So we're talking about tension overload ranges for strength and hypertrophy. They're a little bit different. So hypertrophy is more of a broad adaptation. We have pretty good convincing evidence that, you know, you can train between 30% of your 1 rep maximum, which is your 30 repetition max, and like all the way up to 85%, you know, about 5 rep, you know, your 5 rep max can be that sweet spot for hypertrophy. Just being anywhere within those ranges, as long as you're training within 5 repetitions in reserve or 5 RPE plus, you're going to see adaptations, which is kind of cool. That means that, like, for example, if we're treating somebody in a clinical setting who is sarcopenic, an old person with muscle wasting diseases, or somebody's in a car crash and like they've hurt their leg, or like we can do something called blood flow restriction training that can kind of help. And we can also do low load training but do higher repetitions, and then have linear periodization in that recovery process to kind of just get that person's tissue strengthened again. It's also nice just because in the case of a coronavirus, you can use rather light weights, just do higher reps and still make really solid muscle gains. However, the literature does say probably training within a variety of rep ranges between 5 to 10, of rep range, the 10 to 20 and the 20 to 30, and then loading appropriately, obviously within those load ranges in order to see adaptation is probably the best for muscle hypertrophy all around. So that's something to consider. For volume, it's basically going to be, we're kind of talking about anywhere between 10 to 20 sets per week for anybody who's past like the ranked novice stage of like basically where you can just do 3 sets a week and just grow. Once you become have a higher training status, your body becomes more adapted to the training stimulus because of the repeated bout effect. And the SAID principle, or it's just basically specific adaptations to impose demands, your body just becomes better at handling the stress, and you need more stress at a certain training dose, time under tension, in order to keep making progress in strength and muscle gains. So 10 to 20 sets is usually about the proxy. For beginners in the muscle and strength pyramids from Eric Helms, he recommends between 10 to 12 sets, intermediates between 13 to 15 sets per week, and then advanced lifters for 16 to 20 sets per week. However, those are just recommendations, and you should individualize this to yourself and your own unique training demands, because lifters are not a monolith. Like for myself personally, I average on most of my muscle groups anywhere between 12 to 16 sets per week. That's basically where I find I have really good gains, and outside from a short overreaching phase, for as in the case of like a powerlifting meet, I rarely will go above that, and it's only for a very short period of time, like a week or so, and I pull back to my normal training volumes. But you'll kind of realize this over time. A really good way to know, like, am I getting enough volume in, is simply, am I able to progress at a predictable rate? So beginners will basically be able to progress from session to session. Intermediates might take a week or more to progress, and then advanced lifters, usually it's going to take about an entire training block or whatnot, like a mesocycle, a month long of training, to just really see those gains. So if you're able to progress at a predictable rate, you're probably doing well. However, if you're not progressing very well, and you subjectively don't feel very beat up from your training, you feel understimulated, like you're not getting like many pumps, you don't feel much disruption, you kind of leave the gym, doesn't really feel like much happened to you, you might want to consider increasing your training volume. However, if you are on the opposite side of the camp where you always feel tired, beat up, and like your joints hurt, and just like going to the gym is like, it's hard to get through your sessions all the time, you might want to consider having that training volume pulled back a little bit, because more training volume is not better. You should be training within a good range to see predictable progress that's reliable and that you kind of know is going to come. So that's just my 2 cents on that. And then the last is going to be relative effort. I kind of already alluded to this before, but this kind of goes hand in hand with tension. So as long as you're training within 5 repetitions in reserve or 5 plus RPE, you're going to be making some pretty good gains. So within those tension ranges for hypertrophy of being 30 to 85%, and then for strength is going to be between 60 to 85%, just because training for strength, you have to have a larger actual external load for those neuroendocrine alterations and adaptations to actually happen in the muscles, to actually trigger that nerve impulse to become stronger. And also it just comes down to the principle of Henneman's size principle, which basically states that in order for the larger threshold more units, which are the type 2 fast twitch, you really need to have a larger amount of load actually placed on the muscle. It's just going to be from the literature, it seems to be about 60%, being that, you know, that lowest threshold where they do start to be recruited. In order for them to be recruited, just because they take more energy, they're not as resistant to fatigue, all that stuff. So you do need to have a little bit more external load on the barbell in order to have strength gains actually be achieved for those astral muscle fibers that do contribute to strength in one rep maximum to be recruited. That's why as you do progress in like a linear periodization for powerlifting, your repetitions do get lower because it's going to become more specific to that sport. As well, you're going to be able to recruit more of those high threshold motor units for every single rep and make more of a beneficial strength stimulus. Like this is one of the reasons why the data-driven strength guys and their whole premise about, you know, if there's like a peaking training, like a lower fatigue block or whatever, you know, they'll do like sets or volume within 75 to 85% of one rep max and just accumulate training volume there with a, you know, higher repetitions in reserve around, you know, 5 RIR, you know, just have those strength adaptations that have that hypertrophy response still. So that's something to just like, you know, consider there. But that's essentially why strength has a higher threshold for tension stimulus. But going back to relative effort, as long as you're training with, you know, 5 repetitions in reserve, you're going to be fine. Now, how I recommend, since that can be kind of hard to like know, like how hard are you actually training? So 5 repetitions in reserve is kind of, you know, hard to know. For most cases, I recommend just starting off the training cycle with, you know, something that felt decently hard. Like some repetitions slow down. I like to use, I have you know, an alternate video on this, but essentially I like using like a video and like a actual perception of how heavy the weight felt. So the way it felt, you know, pretty light, and there was very little, like there might have been like very slight slowdown on video, probably RPE 7 or slash like starting to get like a little bit challenging. If it feels kind of heavy, but there's like a very small sticking points when you do look at the weight and RPE. If it feels heavy and there's like a noticeable slowing down, like you really are like trying to like have to like, you know, grind through your reps a little bit, RPE 9. If it's like felt super heavy, it was like super slow on video, you know, RPE 10. But it's gonna be kind of different for everybody though, just being like that being said, just because there is differences between lifters. For example, I can grind through my squats and my deadlifts. I don't grind through bench press. It's something that I know about myself. And probably related a little bit to my individual muscle fiber characteristics. But going back to how I would recommend progressing that is start off with week 1 with a challenging weight that, you know, you go and, you know, it starts feeling hard, then you stop. And then you will kind of do a descending repetitions in reserve scheme where you basically will be increasing the RPE, the actual relative effort, week to week. So for example, in week 1, you would do 4 repetitions in reserve or a 6 RPE. Week 2, you would do 3 repetitions in reserve or a 7 RPE. Week 3, you would do 2 repetitions in reserve or a 8 RPE. Week 4, 1 RIR, and then week 9 being a 9 RPE. And then in like your deload week after that, you would do 5 or more repetitions in reserve or a, you know, less than 5 RPE for that deload week. That's a good way to make sure that you're trying harder, you know, like session to session. An alternate way to do that is the rep load match beat system. So essentially, that basically means, say you're doing like, you know, dumbbell curls. You hit 3 sets of 10 in one week. Well, you know, you're probably going to want to add like 1 rep, you know, per week, like 3 by 11 the next week, 3 by 12 the next week, 3 by 13, 3 by 14, 3 by 15. That's usually pretty good for like isolation movements like a dumbbell curl, a lateral raise. It's just kind of hard to overload, you know, on actual weight, since adding like 5 pounds to the lateral raise, man, like that's a big jump. And so that's why I kind of recommend for more of those isolation single joint exercises, and just focus on really good technique, progressing reps. And then once you hit like the top end of a rep range, so like let's say you're doing like a 3 by 10 to 15 on dumbbell curls. Once you hit all 3 sets of 15 reps, then you would add 5 pounds and then restart the progression model at the appropriate RPE or relative intensities. That's what I would recommend on that. Or you can add 5 pounds to the barbell, 5 to 10 pounds on like, you know, a barbell curl, like something kind of more micro loaded, or a squats, a deadlift, a bench press, something like that. You just try to add 5 pounds until you get to the last week where you just can't add any more weight. It's just past RP 10, you're missing reps, or you know, it's just too hard for you, and then you would deload. So that's my recommendations with that. And so like the reason why I kind of did go a little bit more into this is just because I think it's really important to actually understand like why certain things are said in terms of how hard should you train. So I could just say, oh, for tension, you should train between 30 to 85% for hypertrophy of your 1 rep max. For strength, between 60 to 85% of your 1 rep max. And then in terms of volume, between 10 to 20 sets per week. And then relative effort, between 5 or less repetitions in reserve, or a 5 or more RPE, and then say 5. But like, it's important to understand why we're training, because we just need to be sure that we're training hard and smart, because it's really easy to train hard, but it's really hard to train smart and hard. And so that's why I really focus on the science, the actual understanding of things beyond just saying do X, Y, Z, buy, because it's really important to understand that. So hopefully this video was helpful. If you guys like it, please make sure to like it, comment, share, subscribe. If you guys are interested in coaching, please just contact me on Instagram or my type form, and I'll get back to you. But yeah, if you follow these guidelines, you'll be well on your way to a bigger and stronger you. But thank you guys for watching. I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.